In the synthetic Dreamscape battlefield, Ambassador Jackson Vale was having the kind of morning that only intergalactic diplomacy could ruin. He stood in a vast, holographic wasteland that the Ixtrax called a meditative environment. To Jackson, it looked more like a landfill after a cosmic garbage fire. "Nice place," he muttered, adjusting the ill-fitting collar of his diplomatic uniform. "Could use a few more dead worlds to really spruce it up." Beside him, Dr. Ilara Quill, the physicist whose brain was supposed to be the sharpest tool in humanity's box, snorted. "I'm relieved they didn't go with their first choice, a simulation of their digestive system." She paused, surveying the barren digital landscape. Then again, maybe they did. A gust of simulated wind kicked up, carrying with it the delightful scent of burnt ozone and desperation. "Ah, the smell of diplomacy," Jackson said, breathing it in with exaggerated appreciation. "Nothing like a good whiff of compromise to start the day." Ilara rolled her eyes. "Do you ever take anything seriously?" Jackson, "Sure, I take breakfast seriously. Never skip it before an existential negotiation." He tapped the imaginary watch on his wrist. "Speaking of which, when are our reptilian friends supposed to slither in?" As if on cue, or maybe just to spite him, the air shimmered and the Ixtrax delegation materialized, all scales and Scior expressions. Their leader, a particularly unpleasant specimen named Krathok, had a face like an angry iguana who'd just received a tax audit. "Ambassador Vale, Dr. Quill," Krathok hissed, each word dripping with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for dental surgery without anesthesia. "Welcome to our humble war room. Glad to be here," Krathok, Jackson replied, offering a grin that was mostly teeth and very little warmth. "I see you've spared no expense on the decor." Krathok's eyes narrowed, his pupils contracting to slits. "Humans have always been practical, darn right we are," Ilara cut in, flashing a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Practical enough to bring a little something to liven up the party." The Ixtrax exchanged looks, their scales glinting under the artificial sun. "And what might that be?" Krathok asked, his voice as dry as a desert bone. Ilara glanced at Jackson, who nodded. From her satchel she pulled out a small, innocuous-looking device. It was sleek, black, and utterly unassuming. "Meet the Disruptor," she said with the kind of pride usually reserved for Nobel Prizes or first-edition comic books. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You didn't tell me it was ready, didn't want to spoil the surprise." Ilara winked, then turned back to the Ixtrax. "This little beauty can scramble your best tech like an egg in a blender." Krathok's eyes blinked slowly. "You bluff, human." "Oh, we never bluff," Jackson said, stepping forward. "We lie, cheat, and occasionally steal, but bluffing's just lazy." Ilara tapped the device and the dreamscape flickered as if reality itself had hiccuped. The Ixtrax delegation recoiled, their forms wavering like mirages in a heat wave. "What is this treachery?" Krathok spat, his voice rising in pitch. "Just a little something we cooked up back home," Jackson said, his tone casual, almost bored. "Nothing personal, of course. Just business." Krathok regained his composure, which was impressive given that his entire environment was currently glitching around him. "This will not go unanswered, Ambassador." "Oh, I'm counting on it," Jackson replied, folding his arms. "See, the thing about humans is, we're a bit like cockroaches. Hard to kill and annoyingly persistent." Ilara smirked, slipping the disruptor back into her bag. "We just wanted to give you a taste of what happens when you push us too far." The Ixtrax leader glared at them, his eyes twin pools of venomous hatred. "We are not amused." "Yeah. Well, neither were we when you decided to try and corner us in this little sandbox," Jackson shot back. "Consider this a friendly reminder that we're not keen on being anyone's pet species." Before Krathok could respond, the dreamscape shuddered again, the landscape rippling like a disturbed pond. "Looks like it's time for us to go," Ilara said, giving a mock salute. "Always a pleasure, Krathok. Let's do this again sometime, maybe when you're not plotting our extinction." Jackson and Alara turned to leave, the dreamscape shifting and melting around them, the Ixtrax delegation fading into the glitching scenery. Think they'll retaliate? Alara asked as they walked, her voice low. Of course they will, Jackson replied. Which is why I've got a little backup plan in place. Alara raised an eyebrow. You mean the one where we run like hell? Exactly, Jackson said with a grin. Sometimes the best strategy is the simplest one. As they reached the edge of the dreamscape, the fabric of the simulation tearing like cheap fabric, Jackson couldn't help but chuckle. You know, I think they really like us. Alara laughed, the sound echoing in the digital expanse. Or hate us. Honestly, at this point, what's the difference? With a final, defiant flicker, the dreamscape vanished, leaving Jackson and Alara standing alone in the sterile white of the Ixtrax conference chamber. The stark contrast to the chaotic battlefield was almost jarring. I've always hated these places, Jackson muttered, brushing imaginary dust off his sleeves. Too clean, too quiet. Too alien. Let's hope we've given them something to think about, Alara said, reaching into her bag to clutch the disruptor like a lifeline. Knowing them, they're probably thinking about how to turn us into space dust. Jackson sighed, running a hand through his hair. But hey, at least we're keeping them on their toes, Alara nodded. And if we're lucky, we've bought humanity a little more time. Jackson shot her a sidelong glance. Let's hope it's enough. We're playing a dangerous game, Alara. Dangerous is our specialty, she replied with a wry smile. Besides, it's not like we have much choice. Jackson shrugged. True enough. And who knows? Maybe somewhere in the chaos we'll find a way to end this mess. Alara snorted. Optimism from Jackson Vale. Now I've seen everything. Don't get used to it, he warned. It's a rare commodity these days. They walked side by side, their footsteps echoing in the empty hall as the weight of their predicament settled over them. The universe was vast and uncaring, but for now they were still in the game. And as long as they were, they'd keep fighting against the odds, against the Ixtrax, and against the cynical reality of diplomacy in the cosmos. As they reached the exit, the chamber doors sliding open with a whisper, Jackson paused, casting one last look back. Think they'll forgive us? He asked, only half joking. Alara laughed softly, shaking her head. Not in a million light years, Jackson grinned. Good. I'd hate to think they'd gone soft. With that, they stepped out into the harsh light of reality, leaving the shattered dreamscape behind. The future was uncertain, and maybe that was just how they liked it. After all, in the grand scheme of things, chaos was the only thing they could truly count on. The Ixtrax delegation was not what you'd call a forgiving bunch, nor were they particularly fond of surprises. So when Jackson Vale and Alara Quill strolled back into the Ixtrax conference chamber, the mood could best be described as a funeral where the corpse owed you money. Krathok, the angry iguana of a leader, hadn't taken the humans' little stunt well. Probably didn't improve his mood that they weren't begging for mercy. Explain yourselves, Krathok hissed, his voice like sandpaper across a chalkboard. Immediately, Jackson leaned back in his chair, casual as a cat in a sunbeam. Well, that's just it, isn't it? You see, we were under the impression this was all part of the negotiations. A bit of give and take. We gave, you took. Classic interaction. The rest of the Ixtrax delegation, looking like a reptile convention gone wrong, glared with the kind of intensity that could boil water. Alara, for her part, was unfazed. Krathok, Alara said, trying her best to sound diplomatic, which in her case was like trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole. The disruptor is, well, let's call it an insurance policy. You know, for when negotiations hit a snag. Like finding out your neighbors are planning to terraform your planet into their personal swamp. Krathok's scales glowed a furious shade of iridescent green. This violation of our technological sanctity cannot be ignored. We demand a retraction of this discovery and a detailed explanation of its workings. Jackson grinned, the kind of grin that suggested he'd just swallowed a canary. Sorry, but that's above my pay grade. I just handle the sweet talking and occasional groveling. Alara gave a short, humorless laugh. And really, you're not our type. We prefer negotiations where the threat isn't annihilation. The Ixtrax leader's eyes narrowed to slits. You jest in the face of destruction. Jesting is kind of our thing, Jackson replied, glancing around the room at the gaudy displays of alien opulence. Consider it a defense mechanism, like you and your scales, only less scaly. The room's tension was tighter than a miser's wallet. Krathok turned to his advisors, muttering in their guttural tongue, probably discussing which part of the human anatomy they'd like to serve as a delicacy. Meanwhile, Jackson and Alara seemed to be in a private contest to see who could appear most nonchalant. Perhaps it would be in everyone's best interest to return to the dreamscape, Krathok finally said, his voice barely containing his temper. There, we can discuss terms. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Oh, you mean the digital hellscape we just left? Sure, sounds delightful. Alara nodded, her expression turned mock serious. I do miss the comforting ambience of potential violence. As the Ixtrax prepared to re-enter the dreamscape, Jackson took a moment to consider the raw insanity of their situation. Here they were, two humans against an entire race of technologically advanced space lizards, trying to negotiate their way out of a conflict that was one misplaced joke away from turning real ugly. Krathok led the way, his form shimmering as he re-entered the dreamscape. Jackson and Alara followed, their surroundings once again shifting to the vast, barren battlefield. The landscape was glitching ever so slightly, as if reality itself was having second thoughts about the whole arrangement, rather like Jackson, in fact. Lovely weather we're having in our shared hallucination, Jackson quipped, as he adjusted to the digital war zone. Really brings out the best in people's murderous instincts. Krathok was in no mood for jokes. This arena is a sacred place of negotiation for the Ixtrax. Yeah, sacred. I can see that, Alara said, examining a nearby rock that flickered like a bad TV signal. I assume the decor is meant to inspire cooperation and not, say, existential dread. Jackson turned to Krathok, his tone dropping the lightheartedness for a moment. Look, Krath, can I call you Krath? We're not trying to start a war here. We're just looking for a little respect. Maybe a bit of understanding that humanity's not going to roll over and play dead because you've got a shiny spaceship. Krathok's eyes flickered, the strange light of the dreamscape casting odd shadows across his scales. And how do we know you won't use this? Disruptor against us, against everything we stand for, Jackson shrugged. Well, you don't. But then again, you don't know we won't just go home and forget the whole thing ever happened. Life's full of beautiful uncertainties, ain't it? The Ixtrax leader's patience was clearly wearing thin, but there was a twitch at the corner of his snout that might have been something close to amusement, or maybe just indigestion. And Dr. Quill, Krathok continued, his tone dripping with suspicion, you refuse to divulge the secrets of your invention. Alara crossed her arms, her expression defiant. Let's just say it's on a need-to-know basis, and right now, you don't need to know. Jackson chuckled, the sound echoing through the shifting landscape like a misfired laser blast. Besides, revealing our hand would take the fun out of this little dance, wouldn't it? Krathok's gaze swept over the humans, calculating. Your audacity is intriguing if misguided. Perhaps we can come to an understanding after all. Alara raised an eyebrow. And here I thought understanding was off the menu. Krathok's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow still managed to sound like nails on a chalkboard. The Ixtrax are pragmatic. We know when a battle is not to our advantage. Perhaps we can find mutual benefit in cooperation. Jackson shot Alara a sidelong glance. The Ixtrax leader's offer was tempting, but they'd been in the game long enough to know a loaded gift when they saw one. Cooperation's a two-way street, Krath, Jackson said, with a grin that was half charm, half caution. And we're gonna need some assurances. Maybe a nice fruit basket. Something exotic, you know. Alara snorted. I think what Jackson means is, we're willing to talk, but we're not idiots. Krathok's form shimmered in the dreamscape light, the digital winds carrying the faintest hint of something like a sigh. Very well. We will discuss terms, But know this, humans, the Ixtracs do not forget. Jackson nodded. Neither do we, Krath. But we're willing to try if it means not having our planet turned into a giant Petri dish. The dreamscape flickered, reality slipping in and out like a bad movie cut. Jackson and Alara exchanged a glance. They both knew this was far from over, but at least they were still talking. And in diplomacy, as in life, sometimes that was the best you could hope for. They returned from the digital battleground, the Ixtrac's chamber looming around them like the cold, indifferent universe they'd come to despise. Alara turned to Jackson, a glint of something like hope in her eyes. "You think this'll amount to anything?" she asked, her voice low. Jackson shrugged. "Who knows, but it's a start. And in this line of work, a start's as good as it gets sometimes." Alara chuckled, shaking her head. "You know, for a diplomat, you're a bit of an optimist." "Don't spread it around," Jackson replied, grinning. "I've got a reputation to maintain." They walked towards the exit, leaving the Ixtracs to stew in their own thoughts. Jackson paused at the threshold, looking back at the delegation with a mix of amusement and challenge. "Well, Krath, it's been real. Let's do this again sometime. Next time, maybe we can meet somewhere with a bit more ambience, like a black hole." Krathok gave a low, rumbling growl that might have been a laugh or possibly the prelude to a seizure. "Farewell, humans, until our paths cross again." With that, Jackson and Alara stepped out of the chamber, the door sliding shut with a whisper that could have been relief. They emerged into the corridor, the sterile walls a comforting reminder that, for now, they'd survived another day in the cosmic circus. As they made their way through the maze of alien architecture, Jackson couldn't help but muse on the absurdity of it all. Two humans, in a universe that seemed hell-bent on self-destruction, trying to carve out a sliver of sanity. It was a fool's errand, but then he'd always been a bit of a fool. "So, what's next on the agenda?" Alara asked, breaking into his thoughts. Jackson grinned, the kind of grin that hinted at mischief and mayhem. "Oh, you know the usual. Saving the world, one sarcastic comment at a time." Alara laughed, her voice echoing down the corridor. "Well, in that case, we'd better get started." The universe was vast, cold, and utterly indifferent. But as long as they had each other, and a healthy supply of cynicism, Jackson and Alara figured they might just be able to make a dent in it. After all, stranger things had happened. The Ixtracs conference chamber had a sterile smell, like someone had vacuumed the entire place with industrial-strength bleach and a dash of alien ego. Jackson Vale found it comforting in a bizarre sort of way. The odd scent reminded him of the time he'd spent in the holding cells of intergalactic customs. He'd always wondered if the same contractor did both jobs. "Well, that went swimmingly," Alara remarked as they exited the chamber, her voice dripping with enough sarcasm to drown a star system. "I half expected them to serve us up with a side of their diplomatic efforts." Jackson snorted. "Wouldn't surprise me, though I'd hope for a little seasoning. Maybe some of those fruity Ixtrac spices. I hear they do wonders for tough meat." Behind them, the door slid shut with a soft hiss, a sound that reminded Jackson of a snake deciding they weren't worth the effort of a bite. He glanced sideways at Alara, whose expression was set somewhere between exasperation and amusement. "We need to get our ducks in a row," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Or whatever foul creatures pass for ducks out here," he shrugged. "Yeah, well, ducks are hard to come by in space. We'll settle for keeping our heads above water." "Speaking of which," Alara said, pulling a tablet from her pocket, its surface flickering with data streams, "I've got the team working on that disruptor. We need to know what we've got before we accidentally blow a hole in the galaxy. Or before Krath and his gang decide to blow a hole in us," Jackson added, ever the optimist. As they walked through the labyrinthine corridors of the Ixtracs vessel, Jackson had the distinct feeling of being inside a particularly unfriendly stomach. Everything was too smooth, too cold, and too deliberately unfriendly. The architecture screamed, "You really don't belong here, and don't forget it." "So, what do you make of Krath's offer?" Alara asked. I think it was about as genuine as a politician's promise, Jackson replied. But we play along. Maybe we'll catch them with their scales down. They arrived at their temporary quarters, a cramped space with just enough room to remind them that personal space was a luxury afforded only by those not in the middle of an interstellar diplomatic incident. It was the kind of room that made you question your life choices, right before realizing you had no better options. Alara plopped down into a chair that looked like it had been designed purely to test the limits of human discomfort. "I've got the team working on simulations," she said, glancing at a screen that projected a series of unreadable equations, "trying to figure out what kind of side effects we might expect from the disruptor." Jackson sat opposite her, leaning back with his hands behind his head. Side effects. Like turning all the extracts into disco balls, could be a fun party trick. She shot him an exasperated look. More like what happens when you introduce an untested tech into a synthetic dreamscape. Best case scenario, we crash the party. Worst case. Well, let's not think about the worst case. He chuckled darkly. Worst case, we become the intergalactic cautionary tale of what not to do when meeting your scaly neighbors. As they settled into the rhythm of planning and preparing, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia, at least not entirely. In a place like this, with stakes this high, the line between caution and paranoia wasn't just blurred, it was positively smeared. "Any word from our friends on the outside?" Jackson asked, breaking the silence. Alara nodded, fingers tapping on her tablet. "Command's doing their best to keep our presence under wraps until we know what we're dealing with." But keeping secrets in a galaxy as full of gossip as a bored sorority is a challenge. Humanity's greatest strength, Jackson mused, our capacity to talk ourselves into and out of trouble. "Let's hope it's enough," Alara replied, glancing up from her screen. "The extracts aren't known for their patience, or their sense of humor," Jackson added. "But hey, at least we know we're doing something right if they are this worked up." Alara sighed, pushing her chair back from the table. "I suppose we should get back to it. If Krath's going to make a move, it won't be while we're sitting around reminiscing about what could go wrong." "Yeah," Jackson agreed, standing up with an exaggerated stretch. "Let's get back to saving the universe, one sarcastic comment at a time." They returned to the lab, where their team was huddled over various holodisplays, each showing more confusing data than the last. The lab was a cacophony of blinking lights and beeping machines, the kind of technological circus that would have given any self-respecting scientist a heart attack. "Status update, folks," Alara called, leaning against a console that looked like it had been dragged through a black hole. A young technician with bags under his eyes that suggested he hadn't seen a bed in a week looked up from his station. "We're running simulations," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and exhaustion. "The results are interesting." "Interesting how?" Jackson asked, folding his arms. The technician hesitated, glancing at the data. "Well, it's a bit like trying to predict the weather on a planet with 100 different seasons all happening at once. Best guess, the disruptors interacting with the dreamscape in ways we didn't anticipate." "Like?" Alara prompted. "Like causing feedback loops, spatial distortions, and possibly opening up pathways that were never supposed to exist," the technician replied. "Think of it as throwing a wrench into a machine and then watching the machine build a whole new set of rules around it." Jackson whistled. "Sounds like we've got ourselves a real carnival ride. Any chance we can steer it? That's what we're trying to figure out." Another tech chimed in, buried under a pile of schematic projections. "Right now, we're balancing on the edge of discovery and disaster. Story of our lives," Alara muttered. As the team dove deeper into their research, Jackson tried to ignore the creeping sense of unease gnawing at the back of his mind. Every new discovery seemed to come with its own brand of chaos, each more unpredictable than the last. But then, unpredictability was the name of the game when it came to dealing with the extracts. "Sooner or later, Krath and his pals are going to notice," Jackson said, watching the data scroll across the screens like an endless stream of electronic gibberish. We need to be ready. Ilara nodded, her eyes focused intently on the simulations. Agreed. Whatever happens, we need to be in control of how this plays out. The Ixtrax didn't get to be a galactic power by sitting back and letting things happen. As if on cue, the room's lights flickered, an ominous reminder that not all was well in the depths of space. Jackson felt a shiver creep down his spine, like the cold realization that they were standing on the precipice of something far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. "What's happening?" Ilara snapped, her voice cutting through the sudden tension like a knife. The technician scrambled at his console, eyes wide. "The Ixtrax have deployed countermeasures. It's affecting the Dreamscape interface." "Translation?" Jackson asked, already bracing for the worst. "The Dreamscape is destabilizing," the technician replied, panic edging his tone. "We're looking at potential cross-dimensional contamination." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Sounds messy." Ilara swore, something Jackson had rarely heard her do. "We have to shut it down. Now." But the words were barely out of her mouth before the room was swallowed by a wave of distortion, the reality around them bending and twisting like a funhouse mirror on a bad acid trip. Jackson felt his stomach lurch, a sensation not unlike being flung into deep space without a tether. Ilara's voice was a distant echo. "Hold on to something." As the world snapped back into focus, Jackson found himself sprawled on the floor, his head spinning with the kind of vertigo usually reserved for those unfortunate enough to follow a bottle of cheap spirits with a ride on a roller coaster. He blinked, trying to make sense of the chaos around him. The lab was a mess, data projections flickering like ghosts in a machine, technicians scrambling to regain control of the situation. Ilara was already on her feet, barking orders with the kind of authority that suggested she was just as panicked as everyone else, but had decided to bottle it up for later. "Everyone stay focused," she commanded, her voice cutting through the cacophony. "We need to stabilize the interface. Now." Jackson staggered to his feet, the room tilting dangerously as he tried to regain his bearings. "You know, I've had better welcomes," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Less grumbling, more helping," Ilara snapped, her patience wearing thin. He nodded, moving to help the nearest tech who was wrestling with a console that seemed hell-bent on misbehaving. As he worked, he couldn't help but feel the weight of their precarious situation pressing down on him. They were playing with forces they barely understood, dancing on the edge of disaster with no safety net in sight. "What's the plan, Ilara?" he asked, forcing himself to focus on the problem at hand. "Stabilize the interface," she replied, her eyes glued to the data. "Then we figure out how to counter the Ixtrax's countermeasures." "Sounds simple enough," he said, sarcasm his only refuge against the rising tide of uncertainty. As the team worked, the room slowly stabilized, the lights returning to their normal, reassuring glow. Jackson felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the vast darkness of their predicament. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "All right," Ilara said, her voice steady once more. "We've got a handle on the immediate crisis. Now let's figure out how to turn this to our advantage." Jackson nodded, meeting her determined gaze. "Let's just hope we can outsmart a race of space lizards while we're at it." "Piece of cake," Ilara replied, her lips curving into a wry smile. "After all, we're only human." And as they dove back into the chaos of strategy and survival, Jackson couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance, even if the odds were stacked against them, especially because they were. The Ixtrax conference chamber, with its sterile scent of industrial-strength bleach and alien ego, was suddenly a lot less comforting when the galaxy seemed to be unraveling like a poorly knitted sweater. Jackson Vale looked around, counting the concerned faces of their so-called allies in this interstellar game of chicken. The faces were fewer than he'd like, but then again, diplomacy was never about making friends. More like acquiring temporary allies who'd backstab you the moment it suited them, kind of like high school with spaceships. Ilara Quill, ever the diplomat, was trying to keep the coalition from devolving into a free-for-all. Her voice, usually calm and measured, carried a sharp edge as she addressed the room. "Look, if we start pointing fingers now, we'll end up with more holes than a sieve. Focus on the real threat, those scaly bastards trying to destabilize more than just our dreamscape." Krathok, leader of the Ixtrax delegation and a living embodiment of an angry iguana in a bad mood, was not amused. "Your technology is flawed, human. It threatens the balance." Jackson resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "Flawed, sure. But last I checked, we're not the ones who brought countermeasures to a peace summit. Or did I miss the memo where sabotage was the new handshake?" The Ixtrax leader's eyes narrowed, a low hiss escaping his throat. "Our measures ensure peace through strength." "Peace through strength," Jackson repeated, leaning back in his chair. "You know, that's the kind of logic that gave us nuclear arms. Worked out great for Earth." "Well, the parts that aren't radioactive craters." A few snickers echoed around the room, though some of the coalition partners looked more nervous than amused. The tension was thick enough to slice with a disruptor, and the mood was simmering faster than milk left under a twin sun. Ilara, sensing the precarious balance teetering on the edge of chaos, stepped in. "We all have a vested interest in resolving this peacefully. But the dreamscape is destabilizing, and unless we want to redefine the concept of nightmare, we need to act." A holographic display sprang to life in the center of the table, projections swirling like a miniature galaxy caught in a blender. The dreamscape's instability was visualized in blazing neon. It looked like a bad acid trip on a really boring Thursday. Jackson tapped the display. "So here's the issue. These feedback loops and spatial distortions aren't just affecting us. Our lovely coalition partners are feeling the heat too. And we all know what happens when you mix interspecies tension with a collapsing dreamscape." "Another intergalactic war," Ilara suggested, her face a study in deadpan. Jackson snapped his fingers. "Bingo. And I left my anti-war hat at home." Krathok hissed again, though this time it sounded a tad less hostile. "Your point, Vale." "My point," Jackson said, gesturing at the display, "is that we're all in this mess together. So let's stop throwing space rocks and start figuring out how to stabilize this mess before we all end up as cautionary tales." A heavy silence settled over the room, the kind that made you wish for the comforting sound of explosive decompression. At least then you'd know where you stood, mostly in very small pieces. "Suggestions?" Ilara asked, turning to the room. A representative from the Zathari, a race known for their remarkable ability to hold grudges longer than most species lived, spoke up. "We could attempt a synchronous stabilization protocol. It's risky, but if coordinated correctly, we might prevent a total collapse." Risky was an understatement. Trying to synchronize multiple alien technologies in a rapidly destabilizing environment was about as safe as juggling live grenades while tap dancing on thin ice. But then, desperate times called for desperate measures, and possibly really good insurance. "And if that fails?" Jackson inquired, arching an eyebrow. "We become intimately acquainted with the concept of non-existence," the Zathari replied with a shrug. Jackson chuckled darkly. "Guess it beats dying of boredom." "Let's get on it then," Ilara said, her voice firm with determination. "We need all the teams to coordinate efforts. This isn't just about saving our skins, it's about keeping the galaxy from tearing itself apart." As the coalition partners reluctantly nodded and got to work, Jackson couldn't help but notice the increased input from Ilara's crew. They were scrambling, sure, but with the kind of manic energy that suggested they'd either find a solution or die trying. Preferably the former, with a side of triumph over adversity. The task was monumental. The coalition's technical teams were now frantically comparing notes, arguing over protocols, and occasionally threatening to strangle each other with data cables. Through it all, Jackson and Ilara moved between groups, offering advice, making corrections, and occasionally reminding everyone that they weren't actually trying to kill each other. But sabotage, it seemed, was the flavor of the day. Not an iota into their efforts, Warning klaxons blared as systems throughout the Ixtrax vessel began to glitch. Holodisplays flickered, communications fuzzed, and the labyrinthine corridors of the vessel took on a more sinister hue. "What's happening now?" Jackson groaned, clutching his temples. "Please tell me this is just a fire drill." "Sabotage," Ilara replied, checking her tablet with a grimace. "Someone's trying to derail us from within," Jackson sighed. "As if we didn't have enough problems." "All right, who do we suspect?" "Whoever it is, they're good at covering their tracks," Ilara muttered, her fingers flying over her device. "We need to lock down the critical systems before they do any more damage. So, add playing detective to the list of things we need to do right after save the galaxy from imploding," Jackson said, shaking his head. "No pressure." Krathok, having overheard the exchange, looked over, his reptilian features unreadable. "You suspect one of your own. We trust everyone," Jackson replied with a sardonic grin. "It's the devil inside them we don't." The Ixtrax leader nodded, a grudging respect in his eyes. "If there is treachery, it must be rooted out. Ixtrax honor demands it." "Yeah, because honor is what brings us together in these galactic messes," Jackson muttered under his breath. The Coalition's effort to stabilize the Dreamscape continued, now layered with the added complexity of internal sabotage. It was a logistical nightmare that would have made any sane person question their life choices. But sanity was in short supply these days, much like ducks in space. Hours stretched into eternity as the Coalition worked tirelessly, cross-referencing technologies and protocols in a dizzying display of interspecies cooperation, or what passed for it. The Dreamscape's stability wavered like a drunk trying to stand on a surfboard, but slowly, incrementally, they began to make progress. Jackson, watching the data streams unfold, allowed himself a sliver of hope. "Looks like we might just pull this off." Ilara, standing beside him, shot him a look. "Don't jinx it. We're still knee-deep in trouble." "Trouble's just an opportunity in disguise," Jackson replied with a shrug. "Granted, it's usually disguised as a nuclear bomb, but hey, we take what we can get." As the Coalition continued their delicate dance of techno-diplomacy, Ilara's tablet pinged urgently. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. "We've got another problem." "Of course we do," Jackson said, resigned. "Let me guess, more sabotage." "Worse," Ilara replied, turning the tablet to show him. "Someone's made a move to directly disrupt the stabilizers. If they succeed, we could lose everything." "Someone's got a real flair for the dramatic," Jackson remarked. "So what do we do, fearless leader?" "We stop them," Ilara said, determination burning in her eyes. "Whatever it takes," Jackson nodded, the familiar tension of impending chaos settling in his bones. "All right then, let's play hero." As they moved to counter the threat, the Coalition's fragile unity was put to the test. Trust was a rare commodity, and betrayal loomed like a shadow over their every move. But in the face of adversity, human tenacity had a way of persevering, sometimes out of sheer stubbornness, sometimes out of the simple refusal to let the universe have the last laugh. The stakes were higher than ever, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. But if they could hold it together long enough, maybe, just maybe, they'd live to see another day. And as Jackson barreled into the fray, all he could think was, "Well, if we screw this up, at least we won't be around to hear the 'I told you so's.'" With Ilara at his side, they plunged into the chaos, ready to face whatever lay ahead with the only weapon they truly had, the indomitable, albeit slightly deranged, spirit of humanity. Jackson Vale never liked being the smartest guy in a room full of idiots. It usually meant he had to do all the thinking while everyone else played paint by numbers with the fate of the galaxy. This time was no exception. Standing in the Ixtrax conference chamber, he felt like a janitor at a fireworks factory. One wrong move and everything could go kaboom. "So let me get this straight," Jackson said, gesturing wildly at the holographic display that looked like a toddler's rendition of a Picasso. "The dreamscapes on the verge of collapse were being sabotaged from within, and now we have the Ixtrax ready to pounce on us like starving wolves. Hell, why not add a popcorn machine and call it a circus?" Ilara Quill rolled her eyes, unfazed by his sarcasm. "Look, we need to focus. The alien tech has got a flaw we can exploit, but Rodney and his merry band of naysayers think it's too risky." Jackson massaged his temples. Rodney was the sort of guy who'd see a drowning man and throw him an anchor. "Can we just override his better judgment, or lack thereof?" Ilara sighed. "I wish, but he's got sway and I can't just pull rank without solid backing." "Great," Jackson muttered. "So we're stuck playing nice with the guy who thinks a cautious approach means sitting idly until the universe implodes." Krathok slithered closer, his presence as welcome as a tax audit. "Your internal discord is amusing, human. It weakens you." Jackson flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, we humans love a good melodrama. Keeps things interesting while everything burns." The Ixtrax leader flicked his tongue, a gesture Jackson assumed was akin to a chuckle, though it might have been a prelude to swallowing him whole. "Perhaps you should focus on unity lest your coalition fail." "Oh, we're unified all right," Jackson shot back. "Unified in our desire to not end up as cosmic debris." As Krathok slithered away, Jackson turned to Ilara. "Okay, spill it. What's this flaw in the alien tech, and how can we use it before Rodney talks us into an early grave?" Ilara flicked her tablet. "The Ixtrax tech relies heavily on binary phase resonators, simple but with a critical vulnerability. Hit the right frequency and you can short-circuit the whole system." "And Rodney thinks that's too risky?" Jackson asked, incredulous. "He thinks it could destabilize more than the Dreamscape," Ilara replied. "Could cause a chain reaction and, I don't know, maybe unravel the fabric of reality or something." "Great. So it's not just our necks on the line, it's the entire universe. No pressure." Jackson let out a dry laugh. "Well, if we're gonna screw things up, might as well do it on a grand scale." Ilara's gaze drifted to the coalition delegates, who were now embroiled in a heated debate that probably involved more insults than solutions. "We need to make a move, Jackson. The Ixtrax are getting restless, and who knows what our saboteur's next play is." Jackson's mind raced. "All right, let's play the crazy card. Get me a calm channel to Rodney. Maybe I can convince him we're not all going to end up smeared across the galaxy." Ilara nodded, tapping a command on her tablet. "Consider it done. And Jackson," she added, her tone unexpectedly soft, "try not to make things worse." "Me?" Jackson grinned. "When have I ever done that?" Ilara's look said it all. "Too many times to count." The calm line crackled to life, Rodney's dire face appearing like a disapproving schoolteacher caught on security cam. "Jackson, what do you want?" "Hey, Rodney," Jackson greeted with far too much enthusiasm. "Just wanted to chat about that whole exploiting the alien tech flaw before we're all Stardust thing." Rodney sighed. "This again? Look, I've run the simulations. It's too dangerous." Yeah, and the simulations also said my toaster could gain sentience and start a revolt. But here's the thing, our current options are bad, worse, and catastrophic. We're not exactly drowning in choices." Rodney pinched the bridge of his nose. "And what if it goes wrong, Jackson?" "Then we get a front row seat to the end of everything," Jackson replied with a shrug. "But if we do nothing, the Ixtrax will tear us apart anyway. So let's roll the dice, eh?" Rodney hesitated, the weight of responsibility etched on his face. "Fine, but if this blows up in our faces—" "It won't be the first time," Jackson cut in. "Or the last." The screen went dark and Ilara raised an eyebrow. "Think he'll go along?" "He's too proud to admit it," Jackson said, "but yeah, he'll fold." As the coalition prepared to exploit the flaw, tensions mounted. Jackson found himself in the conference chamber once more, surrounded by partners who were more like frenemies, united in common cause but divided by centuries of mistrust. "Status?" he asked Ilara. "Ready as we'll ever be," she replied. "But there's still resistance, and I don't mean from Rodney." "Saboteur?" Ilara nodded. "Or saboteurs. We've locked down the systems we can, but there's still gaps. It's like trying to hold water in a sieve." Jackson scratched the stubble on his chin. "All right, time to play detective. Any leads?" Ilara handed him a list of names. "These are the ones with access to the critical systems." And before you ask, yes, I've triple-checked. Great, Jackson said, scanning the list. Now all we need is a confession. As they worked through the suspects, the atmosphere aboard the Ixtrax vessel grew even more tense, as if the walls themselves sensed the impending chaos. Jackson felt like he was walking through a powder keg with a faulty lighter. "What's the worst-case scenario here?" Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jackson considered their options. "We fail, the dreamscape collapses, and we're all vaporized or worse. But hey, bright side, no more coalition meetings." Ilara chuckled despite herself. "You always know how to find the silver lining." "Yeah, it's a talent," Jackson replied dryly. It wasn't long before they hit a break in their investigation. One of the technicians, a shifty character named Varric, couldn't keep his story straight. Jackson zeroed in like a hungry hawk. "Varric," Jackson said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "Mind telling us why your access logs don't match your work schedule?" Varric blanched, eyes darting like a cornered rat. I was covering for a colleague. They were sick." "Funny," Ilara cut in, "because we checked and no one called in sick. Care to try again?" Varric's resolve crumbled like cheap plaster. All right, I was approached by someone big. They promised rewards." Jackson leaned closer. "And in return, you sabotaged the coalition efforts." "I didn't know it would go this far," Varric pleaded. "I was just supposed to create diversions, slow you down." "Congratulations," Jackson said. "You've just graduated to Galactic Trader. How's that feel?" Varric's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry, I didn't want this." "Here's what you're gonna do," Jackson said. "You're gonna help us fix your mess. And maybe, just maybe, you'll walk out of this breathing." With the reluctant Varric in tow, Jackson and Ilara set about countering the sabotage. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the Ixtrax ship. "Think we can pull this off?" Ilara asked as they worked. Jackson smirked. "If we don't, well, we'll be too dead to care." Time stretched, a relentless tide that threatened to drown them all. But slowly, painfully, progress was made. Systems came back online, stabilizers hummed with cautious optimism, and the dreamscape flickered in and out of coherence. Krathok appeared, his demeanor unreadable. "You humans surprise me. Perhaps there is more to your tenacity than simple obstinacy." Jackson shrugged. "We're like cockroaches, really. Hard to kill and annoyingly persistent." As the critical moments approached, the coalition partners gathered once more, united by a shared hope and a mutual distrust that could fill a black hole. "Ready?" Ilara asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. Jackson nodded. "Ready to either save the galaxy or go out with a bang." The coalition held its breath as the synchronizing protocol was activated. In those tense seconds, Jackson felt an overwhelming sense of clarity, a calm before the storm. They'd either make it out of this alive, or they'd be a footnote in the universal history of epic failures. As the simulation unfolded, the Ixtrax vessel hummed with the combined efforts of a dozen species working in tenuous harmony. The dreamscape's violent ripples slowed, then smoothed like a raging sea finally finding peace. For a moment, silence reigned, uneasy, tentative, but undeniably promising. "We did it," someone voiced, disbelief tinged with awe. Jackson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Looks like it, and we didn't even have to sacrifice a goat." Ilara punched his arm lightly. "You had to go there. Hey, if you can't laugh at the end of the world, what can you do?" As the coalition partners began to relax, relieved murmurs filling the chamber, Jackson felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, but the scars of their ordeal would linger. "Guess we live to fight another day," Jackson remarked, surveying the room. Ilara nodded, a ghost of a smile on her lips. "And maybe, just maybe, we've earned a bit of trust in the process." Krathok approached, his tone almost respectful. "Your actions have proven. Commendable, human." "Thanks," Jackson replied, feigning modesty. "We try." As the coalition partners began to discuss the future, Jackson found himself standing beside Ilara, gazing at the restored dreamscape. "So what now?" she asked. Jackson chuckled. Now we figure out how to keep this piece from unraveling and maybe get a drink or 10. Amen to that, Ilara agreed. And as they turned to face the uncertain future, Jackson knew one thing for sure. They'd earned the right to be a thorn in the universe's side for a little while longer. Jackson Vale sat hunched over the small holographic table, its display flickering like a malfunctioning disco ball. Ilara Quill was next to him, her eyes scanning the chaotic mess of data streams that looked like a toddler's attempt at modern art. She poked at her tablet, her fingers dancing like pianists who'd had too much vodka. "All right, genius," she said, not looking up. "What's our next move before the extracts decide we're more trouble than we're worth and turn us into a side dish?" Jackson grinned, but it was the grin of a man who'd stepped on a rake a few too many times. "Simple. We need to sell them on our greatest strength." "Which is?" Ilara raised an eyebrow, her patience thinner than the air outside the vessel. "Our charming unpredictability," Jackson replied, leaning back in his chair. "Humans are like the universe's wild card. We're irrational, pesky, and damned resilient." "Sounds more like a sales pitch for cockroaches," Ilara muttered, her eyes returning to the tablet. "But go on." Jackson pushed the holographic display to show a new perspective. The dreamscape, a swirling pit of chaos poised on the edge of collapse. "Your team uncovered a critical insight, right? Something that could turn this whole nightmare into a slightly less nightmarish daydream." Ilara nodded. "Turns out the dreamscape isn't just a battleground. It's alive, in a sense. Reactive to intentions, desires, fears. We might be able to manipulate it if we can align our intentions." "And the alien coalition?" Jackson asked, knowing the answer before he finished the question. "Too busy bickering to even consider that option. They're treating it like a chessboard when it's more like poker," Ilara said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Exactly. So we play to our strengths. We destabilize their unity by introducing a little human chaos into the mix," Jackson suggested, his eyes alight with mischief. Ilara looked at him, half amused, half concerned. "You're serious? We're going to wing it, that's the plan. Hey, it's better than standing around with our thumbs up hour." Okay, Ilara interrupted, rolling her eyes. "I get it." As they hammered out the details, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to become the universe's most infamous suicide squad. But what was life without a little risk? Boring, for one thing. Ilara sent out discreet messages to their allies, handpicking those who were both competent and willing to gamble with the galaxy's fate. The coalition partners, blissfully ignorant of the upcoming human intervention, continued their endless squabbles like a roomful of cats with a single ball of yarn. Jackson leaned back, watching the extract's leader, Krathok, who regarded the chaos with the bemused expression of a grandparent watching children play with fire. He couldn't help but think that the extract's leader saw this whole ordeal as a cosmic joke, one that might end with everyone in stitches or in ashes. "We're gonna need a diversion to keep the scaly bastards occupied while we rig the dreamscape," Jackson mused aloud, as much to himself as to Ilara. Ilara nodded, tapping away. "I'll work with our techs to generate a high-intensity data burst. Should keep them busy wondering what the hell we're up to." "Good. I'll rally the troops, or the misfits as the case may be," Jackson replied, standing up and stretching like a man preparing for battle or a particularly taxing game of charades. As he moved through the extract's vessel, its labyrinthine corridors colder than a politician's heart, Jackson considered their odds. Not great, but then the human race had never let probability get in the way of a good story. Back in the conference chamber, Jackson gathered the human contingent. A ragtag bunch of engineers, soldiers, and diplomats who looked like they'd seen better days and worse nights. "Listen up, folks," Jackson began, seeing more skepticism than enthusiasm in their eyes. "We're about to do something incredibly stupid. Which, let's be honest, is pretty much our forte. A few chuckles, a good sign. Gallows humor was their bread and butter. We're going to exploit a flaw in the dreamscape. It's risky, but then so is everything else we do. If it works, we'll destabilize the alien coalition's unity and maybe, just maybe, save our skins." And if it doesn't work? Someone asked, their voice thick with doubt. Jackson shrugged. Then we get a close-up view of our own annihilation, but we'll cross that bridge when it vaporizes. More laughter, albeit nervously, filled the room. Support, or at least resignation, was building. Look, we're all here because we believe in something, Jackson continued, letting the sincerity slip through for just a moment. Or because we have nothing left to lose. Either way, let's make the most of it. With a collective nod, the group dispersed to prepare for the operation. Jackson felt a sense of grim determination settle over him like an old, uncomfortable coat. Returning to Alara's side, he found her deep in conversation with Krathok, who looked as inscrutable as ever. "Ah, Jackson," Krathok said, his voice smooth and silkily condescending. "I hear you plan to introduce a new level of chaos into our proceedings." "Thinking outside the box, Krath," Jackson replied, flashing a grin that was more teeth than humor. "Hope you don't mind a little turbulence." The Ixtrax leader's eyes gleamed like dark stars. "On the contrary, I find human unpredictability entertaining. Besides, it might be the only thing capable of tipping the scales." "Glad to have your support," Jackson said, not entirely sure if he was being sincere or sarcastic. Probably both. With the stage set, Alara and her team began executing the plan. The coalition partners, still embroiled in arguments and ego contests, remained oblivious to the human maneuvering happening right under their noses. Jackson and Alara moved to the control room, where screens displayed the Dreamscape's turbulent landscape. The plan was simple: synchronize their intentions to disrupt the alien coalition's influence, creating just enough chaos to fracture their unity. "Ready?" Alara asked, her fingers poised above the controls. "Born ready," Jackson replied, though he suspected he was born more for causing chaos than resolving it. Alara initiated the protocol, and the room filled with the hum of the Dreamscape reacting to their intentions. It was like trying to calm a storm with a lullaby sung by a tone-deaf choir, but they pressed on. As the coalition partners continued their bickering, the Dreamscape began to shimmer and shift, responding to the human input. Ripples of energy spread across its surface, distorting reality in unpredictable ways. Jackson watched, a mix of hope and dread churning in his gut. "Think it'll work?" he asked, eyeing the Dreamscape like a gambler watching a potentially winning hand. "It has to," Alara replied, her voice tinged with determination. Suddenly, the Dreamscape pulsed, a wave of energy washing over the alien delegates. Confusion spread like wildfire as the coalition's unity fractured, their minds filled with conflicting intentions. "What is happening?" one of the delegates shouted, eyes wide with panic. "Looks like we're getting results," Jackson said, turning to Alara with a hint of triumph. Krathok chuckled, the sound like gravel rolling down a hill. "A masterstroke of chaos, humans. Truly, you are the universe's jesters." "I'll take that as a compliment," Jackson replied, his eyes never leaving the Dreamscape. With the coalition's unity disrupted, the balance of power shifted. The Ixtrax, sensing an opportunity, began to assert control, their influence spreading through the Dreamscape like ink in water. "Let's not waste this chance," Alara urged, her fingers flying over the controls. Jackson nodded, his mind racing. "Time to push the advantage. We need to solidify our position before they regroup." As Alara and her team worked to stabilize their new foothold in the Dreamscape, Jackson coordinated with the human contingent, ensuring their efforts remained focused and effective. Despite the chaos, a sense of hope slowly emerged. Maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off. In the conference chamber, the alien delegates struggled to regain their composure. Their once flawless unity now fragmented by human intervention. Jackson couldn't suppress a grin. "Looks like we threw a spanner in their works." Alara smirked, a rare moment of satisfaction on her face. "Leave it to humans to make a mess of things and call it progress." Amidst the disarray, Krathok approached, his expression inscrutable. "Your actions have brought about an unexpected outcome. The Ixtrax commend your ingenuity." Glad to hear it, Jackson replied, his tone light despite the tension. We aim to please. As the coalition partners slowly came to terms with the new reality, Jackson and Alara stood side by side, watching as the dreamscape continued to evolve. Think this'll hold? Alara asked, her voice a mix of hope and skepticism. Depends, Jackson replied, his eyes on the shifting landscape. But we've given it a fighting chance, and sometimes that's all you need. With the immediate crisis averted, the coalition partners began to regroup, their focus now on finding a way forward in this new, chaotic landscape. For Jackson and Alara, the journey was far from over, but they'd taken the first step toward reclaiming their future. And as they prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They'd survived another day, and in this unforgiving universe, that was no small feat. Jackson Vale stood in the control room, surveying the unfolding chaos on the holographic display. It looked like a toddler's rendition of a Picasso, but with more explosions. The alien coalition was falling apart like a house of cards in a wind tunnel, each delegate grappling with fractured intentions. It was almost poetic if poetry was inherently explosive and unpredictable. Jackson, you ever think maybe we're just the universe's way of having a laugh? Alara Quill asked, tapping away at her tablet with the focus of a cat stalking a laser pointer. All the time, Alara. All the damn time, Jackson replied, leaning against the console. But hey, if the universe wants a comedy show, I'm not about to disappoint. Krathok slithered up, the Ixtrax leader looking as amused as ever. Your chaos is highly efficient, humans. It's impressive in a way that only something completely uncontrollable can be. Well, we aim to misbehave, Jackson shot back, his grin more wolfish than friendly. The dreamscape's turbulence was like a mixer set to high, each ripple of chaos sending the coalition partners into further disarray. The Ixtrax were poised to pounce, their predatory instincts honed to a fine edge. All right, Alara, Jackson said, turning to her with that mischievous glint in his eye. Time to bring out the big guns. Let's see what your new physics trick can do. Alara smirked, a dangerous look in those sharp eyes. I've been waiting for this. Her fingers danced over the controls, inputting commands with the precision of a surgeon operating on a particularly uncooperative patient. The dreamscape began to shimmer, a kaleidoscope of possibilities twisting and turning, each one bending to Alara's will. The alien tech, so advanced it practically sneered at human efforts, started to glitch like a cheap holoflick on a rainy day. Looks like their tech is having a bit of a seizure, Jackson noted, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. Guess they didn't plan for a little human ingenuity. We're like a virus, Alara said, her lips curling into a sardonic smile, infecting their systems, making them glitch out. Bet they didn't see that coming, Krathok chuckled, a sound that was equal parts gravel and delight. Fascinating. We have underestimated the impact of your unpredictability. Jackson clapped him on the back, or at least tried to, given the Ixtrax's lack of a traditional spine. Glad to know we can still surprise you, Krath. Keeps things interesting. Meanwhile, the coalition was scrambling, their unity unraveling faster than a politician's promise. Jackson's diplomatic machinations, a mix of charm, thinly veiled threats, and the occasional well-placed bribe, were paying off spectacularly. Allies turned into rivals, and rivals into outright enemies. Rodney's gonna love this, Alara said, referring to the ever-cautious naysayer who often found Jackson's methods reckless. Nothing says we told you so like a complete and utter breakdown of enemy lines. Jackson laughed, a deep, rich sound that filled the room. Rodney can shove it. We're doing what needs to be done, and it's working. The Ixtrax, sensing the shift in power, pressed their advantage, their forces moving with the precision of a well-coordinated orchestra. It was a shame, really, Jackson thought. Such careful choreography, only for humans to come waltzing in with their own brand of chaotic rhythm. Keep them off balance, Alara, he instructed, watching the unfolding debacle with something akin to pride. We need to maintain this momentum. Don't worry, I've got a few more tricks up my sleeve, Elara replied, her eyes alight with that particular brand of mischief they both shared. As the coalition continued to fracture, Jackson took a moment to appreciate the irony. Here they were, amidst the cosmic theater of war, and somehow the humans were improvising a symphony of chaos that even the most seasoned diplomats couldn't have orchestrated. Krathok seemed to share his sentiment, his gaze fixed on the dreamscape's ever-shifting landscape. It's almost beautiful in its own way, a testament to your species' irreverence. Thanks, Krath. We try, Jackson quipped, his attention never straying far from the displays. The Ixtrax leader considered him, those dark eyes glinting with amusement. Do you truly believe you'll hold this advantage? Jackson shrugged, a gesture of defiant uncertainty. We've got a shot. And sometimes, a shot is all you need. Elara's fingers never stopped moving, her commands weaving through the dreamscape like a maestro conducting an orchestra of chaos. The alien tech continued to malfunction, each glitch a testament to human ingenuity and the power of thinking outside the proverbial box. I can almost hear the coalition's gears grinding, Elara said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Good. Let them grind. We need every edge we can get, Jackson replied, his gaze fixed on the displays. Despite the chaos, there was a certain harmony to their efforts. The coalition was in disarray, the Ixtrax were asserting control, and humanity, against all odds, was carving out their own niche in this interstellar mess. We've created a monster, Elara remarked, her tone wry. Yeah, but at least it's our monster, Jackson retorted, his grin as irrepressible as ever. Krathok nodded, the shadows of a smile flickering across his features. Indeed. You humans have a peculiar knack for turning the tide, Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. We're just full of surprises, aren't we? The Ixtrax were taking full advantage of the coalition's disarray, their forces moving with a deadly grace that was almost admirable. Jackson watched, knowing that this was their moment, the climax of their daring gamble. Think it'll hold? Elara asked, glancing over at him with a mix of hope and skepticism. For now, Jackson replied, his voice steady. But the real trick is making sure it holds long enough for us to get what we need. As the coalition partners stumbled through the chaos, trying desperately to regain their footing, Jackson and Elara stood side by side, watching the dreamscape's evolution with a cautious optimism. We've bought ourselves some time, Jackson said, his gaze never wavering from the displays. Let's make the most of it. Elara nodded, her focus unbroken. We will. We're in this together for better or worse. Jackson smiled, a rare flicker of genuine warmth beneath the layers of sarcasm and bravado. Damn right. With the tide turning in their favor, Jackson and Elara knew that their battle was far from over. They had fractured the coalition, leveraged chaos to their advantage, and staked a claim in this unforgiving universe. As they prepared to face the challenges ahead, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They'd survived another day, another confrontation with forces far greater than themselves. And in this grim, relentless cosmos, that was an achievement worth celebrating. Here's to chaos, Jackson said, raising an imaginary glass. And to the humans who make it happen, Elara replied, her smirk as sharp as a blade. Krathok watched them, a silent observer to their irreverent camaraderie. I believe you may have just changed the course of this conflict. Jackson shrugged, his grin irrepressible. We do what we can. With their immediate crisis averted, Jackson and Elara turned their attention back to the task at hand. The alien coalition was still a threat, their resolve shaken but not shattered, their determination to regain control evident. But for now, in this moment of precarious victory, Jackson allowed himself a moment of optimism. They'd taken the first step toward reclaiming their future, and with a little luck, a lot of cunning, and a healthy dose of chaos, they might just pull it off. As the dreamscape continued to evolve under Elara's deft touch, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They were the underdogs, the unexpected victors in a game rigged against them. And as long as they were still standing, they had a chance. "We're not done yet," Ilara reminded him, her tone as pragmatic as ever. "No, we're not," Jackson agreed, the fire of determination burning bright in his eyes. "But we're just getting started." And with that they turned back to the challenge ahead, their spirits unbroken, their resolve undiminished. They were humanity's last hope, the wild card in a game of cosmic stakes, and they were ready to do whatever it took to win. The control room was buzzing with the kind of tense energy that could power a small starship. Jackson stood in the center of it all, like a conductor leading an orchestra that was forever on the verge of a spectacular crash. The holographic display flickered as it struggled to keep pace with the chaos unfolding in the dreamscape. "Well, Ilara," Jackson mused, watching the extracts retreat with the kind of speed that suggested they just remembered they'd left the oven on. "Looks like we finally turned the tables on those scaly bastards." Ilara, her eyes still glued to her tablet, executed a few final commands. "You know, I'd almost feel sorry for them if they weren't such insufferable pricks." Krathok, the unofficial king of sarcasm among the extracts, slithered into view with a smirk that looked like it belonged on a politician just after a rigged election. "I must commend your tenacity. You've managed to snatch chaos from the jaws of disaster." Jackson chuckled. "That's us. Always one step away from screwing up, but somehow the universe decides to let us off the hook. More like we cheat when nobody's looking," Ilara added, her fingers still dancing over her tablet as though it held all the secrets of the universe. Krathok inclined his head, a gesture that might have been a nod under different circumstances. "Indeed. It's a quality I imagine will serve you well in the times to come." The dreamscape, now stabilizing like a drunk finding their footing, began to settle into a semblance of order. The extract's forces, previously poised to pounce, were now retreating, their predatory instincts dulled by the unexpected turn of events. "Looks like the coalition's got a new set of problems on their hands," Jackson observed, his tone as dry as a desert planet during a drought. "We've just shown them how to win by losing control," Ilara snorted. "Diplomacy's never been our strong suit, but chaos, we've got that down to an art form. Rodney, the eternal skeptic, would have had a field day with this. But he wasn't here, and that was probably for the best. Less chance of an aneurysm that way." "So, what's next?" Ilara asked, her voice filled with that mix of hope and exasperation that came from surviving a disaster by the skin of your teeth. "Next, we see what kind of mess this has left us in," Jackson replied, his eyes scanning the displays like a captain surveying the aftermath of a particularly nasty storm. "But for now, let's just bask in the glow of not being entirely screwed." "Always the optimist, aren't you?" Ilara quipped, but there was a warmth to her words that suggested they'd both earned a little optimism. With the extracts retreating and the dreamscape steadying, a new, more manageable chaos began to emerge. The coalition, while battered, was still standing, albeit on wobbly legs. A shaky unity at best, but it was something to build on or blow up depending on how things went. Jackson turned his attention back to Krathok. "So, what's the plan for you and your merry band of reptiles? Gonna slink back to whatever rock you crawled out from?" Krathok chuckled, a sound like a landslide-given voice. "We have much to consider. This encounter has proven enlightening. Glad we could be your educational field trip," Ilara said, her words dripping with sarcasm. "We're about as educational as a bar brawl," Jackson added. "But hey, if it works, it works." With the extracts defeated, or at least temporarily subdued, the dreamscape began to stabilize in a way that suggested the universe might finally be catching a break. The swirling chaos that had threatened to consume them all was now a manageable storm, its fury contained, if only for the moment. "Ever feel like we're just one glitch away from catastrophe?" Ilara asked, her eyes not leaving her tablet as she performed what felt like the millionth system check. "Only every day," Jackson replied. "But I'd say this whole mess has bought us a little breathing room." The The coalition, once a collection of uneasy allies, now had a new dynamic to contend with. Humanity, against all odds, had secured a position of strength, however tenuous it might be. It was a curious thing, watching power shift so dramatically, like a seesaw with a rhino on one end and a feather on the other. "It's funny," Alara said, her voice contemplative. "If someone had told me we'd end up here, I'd have laughed them out of the room." "Well, here we are," Jackson replied, leaning back against the console with the air of a man who knew he'd just cheated death. "And I'm fresh out of witty one-liners." Krathok watched them, his alien gaze inscrutable. "You humans have a remarkable capacity for survival. It will be interesting to see how you utilize this newfound position. With any luck, not by screwing up on an intergalactic scale," Jackson said. Alara smirked. "Minimal screw-ups would be a nice change." The Ixtrax leader inclined his head again. "We shall see. Until then, the dreamscape is yours to navigate." With that, Krathok slithered away, leaving Jackson and Alara to contemplate the tangled web they'd woven. The Ixtrax might have retreated, but they were far from defeated. Jackson knew better than to count on them staying down for long. "So, what now?" Alara asked, her voice carrying a note of determination that belied her exhaustion. Jackson considered the question. "Now, we regroup, figure out how to turn this temporary victory into something lasting, and try not to piss off any more alien coalitions in the process," Alara added, a wry smile playing at the corners of her lips. Jackson grinned. "Where's the fun in that?" The control room settled into a semblance of calm, the kind that follows a storm. Jackson and Alara stood side by side, surveying the scene as if daring the universe to throw another curveball their way. "We've got a long road ahead," Jackson said, his tone both resigned and resolute. "As always," Alara replied, glancing over at him with a look that said they'd been through hell and back, and they'd do it again if they had to. They'd made it this far, against all odds and with nothing but their wits and a healthy dose of reckless abandon. In the grand scheme of things, they were still the underdogs in a galaxy that liked to chew up and spit out anything that dared to fight back. But for now, they'd bought themselves a little time, a chance to regroup and strategize. "To not being entirely screwed," Jackson said, raising an imaginary glass once more. Alara chuckled. "I'll drink to that." As they stood in the quiet aftermath, the dreamscape stable and the Ixtrax temporarily defeated, a new reality began to unfold. Humanity, against all odds, had carved out a place of strength in a galaxy that had never given them much of a shot. It was a fragile victory, one that could crumble at any moment, but it was theirs. "So you're saying we actually did something right for once?" Alara asked, her voice carrying that signature mix of incredulity and amusement. "Seems like it," Jackson replied. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still a lot that could go wrong. A pessimist and a realist walk into a bar," Alara quipped. "And both agree it's probably going to explode." Jackson laughed, shaking his head. "I'll take it. At least it's our explosion." With the Ixtrax defeated and the dreamscape stabilized, humanity had secured a new position of strength. It was a precarious victory, built on the shifting sands of chaos and unpredictability, but it was theirs. And as long as they kept moving forward, they had a fighting chance. "Think we'll ever get used to this?" Alara asked, her voice a mix of weariness and determination. Jackson shrugged. "Probably not, but that's half the fun, isn't it?" Alara smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Yeah, I suppose it is." As they prepared to face the broader cosmic implications of their newfound position, Jackson and Alara knew that their journey was far from over. The galaxy was still a dangerous, unpredictable place, filled with enemies and allies alike. But for now, they had a moment of peace, a chance to catch their breath before diving headfirst into the next challenge. "To chaos," Jackson said, raising his imaginary glass once more. "And to the humans who thrive in it," Alara replied, her smile as sharp as ever. Krathok watched them, a silent observer to their irreverent camaraderie. "I believe you may have just changed the course of this conflict." Jackson shrugged, his grin irrepressible. "We do what we can." As they stood together, the future uncertain but full of possibilities, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They'd faced impossible odds, navigated the treacherous waters of intergalactic diplomacy, and come out the other side stronger for it. They were humanity's last hope, the wild card in a game of cosmic stakes, and they were ready to do whatever it took to win. "No time like the present to start winning hearts and minds," Jackson said, his voice filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Ilara nodded, her determination unwavering. "Let's show them what we're made of." With that, they turned back to the challenge ahead, their spirits unbroken, their resolve undiminished. The galaxy might be a dangerous, unpredictable place, but they were ready to face it head-on. As the dreamscape continued to evolve under Ilara's deft touch, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They were the underdogs, the unexpected victors in a game rigged against them. And as long as they were still standing, they had a chance. "We're not done yet," Ilara reminded him, her tone as pragmatic as ever. "No, we're not," Jackson agreed, the fire of determination burning bright in his eyes. "But we're just getting started." And with that, they turned back to the challenge ahead, their spirits unbroken, their resolve undiminished. They were humanity's last hope, the wild card in a game of cosmic stakes, and they were ready to do whatever it took to win.